The corridor of Detroit Mercy Hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright, too sterile, exposing everything. Nurses moved quickly past, whispering, glancing at the scene unraveling in room 114. On the bed sat Alana Johnson, 29, a black woman whose strength had been stretched thin by life but never broken. She cradled her newborn son close to her chest, his tiny breaths warm against her collarbone. Her arms trembled, not from the exhaustion of labor, but from the storm raging in the room. Because towering above her, with rage carved into his pale face, stood Richard Coleman, a billionaire, a white man who had never been told no in his life. His voice cracked like a whip against the walls. "That baby ain't mine." The words ricocheted through the hall, brutal and final. The nurses froze. A janitor pushing a mop bucket stopped dead in his tracks. Everyone knew his face. The Detroit news was full of Richard Coleman, the steel tycoon, the man whose money had built half the skyscrapers in Michigan. Now that man was snarling down at the woman who had once scrubbed his marble floors. Alana's lips pressed into a thin white line. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat felt like it had closed forever. Richard jabbed a finger toward her chest, toward the bundle swaddled in blue hospital cloth. "You really think I'd fall for this cheap trick? A maid, a nobody? This is pathetic, Alana." Her shoulders curled inward protectively, sheltering the child as if her own body were a shield against the storm. Her eyes burned, swollen not from childbirth but from nights of crying in silence. "Please." Her voice came out as a whisper, ragged, broken from fatigue. "Just look at him." I did look. Richard snapped, pacing the linoleum like a predator in a cage. "He looks like every other damn baby in this place. You think you can trap me with this?" But then, fate, or truth, intervened. The blinds shifted in the breeze from a cracked hospital window. A shaft of morning sunlight fell across the newborn's face. Richard's words caught in his throat. The baby opened his eyes. They were not brown like Alana's, not blue like thousands of other infants born every year. They were storm gray, that rare, haunting hue Richard carried himself, a genetic quirk that had passed from his father to him, a color so distinct it was practically a signature. For a heartbeat, Richard froze. His jaw slackened. His heart hiccuped once, betraying the man who prided himself on total control. Alana saw it, the flicker of recognition, the fracture in his armor. She whispered again, a plea not for herself but for the life in her arms. "Please, just look at him." Richard's gaze dropped further, tracing the baby's skin, pale, too pale to dismiss. The echoes of his own bloodline were written plainly in this fragile child. But pride is stronger than truth when truth threatens to topple an empire. He blinked hard, forcing the crack shut, rebuilding the mask. His voice dropped lower now, quiet but heavy with contempt. "Don't play games with me, Alana. I came here to put an end to this circus. Whatever fantasy you've cooked up, it ends now." A nurse in the doorway shifted uncomfortably, wanting to speak but silenced by fear of the man's power. Alana felt the weight of the hospital room press down on her. She had no lawyers, no millions, no boardrooms to back her. All she had was the truth, and the child whose tiny fingers curled against her skin. Her mind drifted for a moment, an unwilling escape from the present pain. She remembered nights in Coleman's mansion, the 6 acres of manicured perfection in Fairfield County. She remembered his voice slurred with bourbon, the glint in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Now here he was, pretending none of it had ever happened. Alana rocked the baby gently, humming a lullaby her mother once sang to her, a sound so soft it barely reached her own ears. She didn't look up at Richard again. She didn't beg. She knew there was no winning a war against a man like him. Not today. But the hesitation she had glimpsed, that moment when his gaze had locked with his son's, planted something inside her, a seed of hope, or maybe a weapon. Because no matter how many billions Richard Coleman controlled, no matter how many lies he could buy, he could never erase what she had just seen in his eyes. The truth had already entered him, whether he liked it or not, and truth, once seen, has a way of coming back, before the hospital glare and the hiss of Richard's denial. There was the house and estate that looked like it had been poured from money, and polished with silence. Coleman House sat at the edge of Fairfield County like a glittering threat, glass walls that reflected sky instead of people, marble floors to clean to remember a footprint, hedges trimmed so precisely you'd swear the gardener carried a ruler in his pocket. Beauty used to intimidate Alana. In this place, beauty felt like surveillance. She'd arrived in late fall, the air thin with the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke. The agency's note had been simple: live in domestic. Light child care. Discretion required. Light child care turned out to mean keeping a 4-year-old entertained in rooms the size of basketball courts while the nanny handled appointments. Discretion meant being invisible. You learned quickly in houses like this: silverware the weight of old coins, towels with initials, a kitchen where no one cooked what your place was. Your place was quiet. Alana made a ritual of her mornings. Up at 4:40 a.m. to beat the head housekeeper into the pantry. Uniform pressed, sneakers clean, hair braided back tight. Inventory: first glass cleaner, microfiber cloths, lemon oil. Then the glass staircase. The banister that curved like a question mark from the first floor to the second. Always smudged by small hands by night, shining by dawn. She took satisfaction in restoring what the day had scuffed. It was a small defiance. You will see the work, even if you refuse to see me. She noticed Richard in fragments. A door closing on a conference call. His voice clipped as a paper cut. A coat thrown across the back of a chair like the ending of a sentence. A child Jason sprinting into him and bouncing off like a rubber ball. The father's palm hovering an inch above the boy's head as if touch might stain him. The wife, Evelyn, was a perfume trail and the click of heels, a charity gala announced by gowns. There were photos of their faces in magazines on the kitchen island. The family a brand, Coleman Steel, American might with a human face. Human faces didn't spend much time on the domestic floor. That was where Alana lived, down a hallway painted the color of caution, behind a door that stuck unless you pulled hard. The room was barely larger than the laundry cart. She pinned a photo of her mother to the corkboard above the narrow bed. The woman's eyes were steady in the snapshot, proud in a way that made Alana square her shoulders each morning. On nights when the wind scratched at the windows, she would touch the corner of the picture and whisper, "I'm working, Ma, I'm trying." The winter gala arrived like a storm disguised as a celebration. Delivery trucks exhaled into the driveway. Florists invaded the dining room with white orchids that looked like delicate ghosts. A tent went up on the lawn, heat lamps humming. The caterers had a map of tiny foods to pass like secrets from hand to hand. Alana polished the stemware until her fingerprints disappeared. She ironed napkins with the Coleman monogram C like a crescent moon, S like a snake, and stacked them in perfect towers. Guests came in waves of silk and laughter. A senator, a tech founder whose app kept people from falling asleep, a philanthropist whose money had a halo. The house vibrated with approval. Evelyn floated, her smile professionally soft. Richard drank bourbon that matched his tie. Jason had been shipped to a sleepover. A house like this didn't have edges for children to hold on to. After midnight, heat lamps flickering out and music down to a heartbeat, the staff began triage. Champagne flutes herded into crates. Shrimp tails rescued from the mouths of vases. Alana moved like she always did, fast, precise, grateful that the work had rules. She was in the study wiping a ring of condensation off the corner of the desk when she heard the door click. Richard leaned against the frame as if gravity were optional when you own so much land. His tie was crooked, top button open, eyes bright with drink. "You work hard," he said. Not a question. Alana kept her gaze on the cloth. "It's my job, sir. Don't sir me in my own house." He smiled, as if he were being gracious, as if kindness were a performance for which she owed applause. He walked to the bar, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, then poured 2 more. "People never look up in this place," he said, staring into the glass. "They look at the brand, the numbers, the metal. They don't look up." His eyes lifted to hers. "You look up." She stepped back, the cloth catching on a book's corner. "I'll come back for the study in the morning. You're different," he said. Not like the others, eyes always on the floor. She was silent. Her mother had taught her, silence can be a shield, child. Let other people hear themselves talk. The room felt too warm. The chandelier threw light like a net. Richard took a step forward, then another, the air between them narrowing to a hallway. He wasn't leering. That would have been easier to reject. He performed something more dangerous, a soft voice, a tilt of the head, a suggestion that he had chosen to see her, and therefore she should be grateful. Power wrapped in gentleness has a way of feeling like a favor. She said his name once. He said hers back like a promise. She could still feel the slick of lemon oil on her fingertips, the coolness of crystal against her wrist as she brushed the bar. She could still hear the muffled thud of bass under the tent, cutlery chimming like distant insects. Afterward, he straightened his tie and told her to lock the door behind her. She did. The hallway felt longer than any road she'd ever walked. The next mornings were a choreography of pretending. She ironed while her mind refused to settle. She straightened pillows that did not need straightening. He didn't look at her in daylight. No nod, no word. Invisibility resumed as policy. When she found herself scrubbing the same square foot of marble for 5 whole minutes, the head housekeeper tapped her shoulder. "You all right?" "Didn't sleep," Alana said, which was true. Sleep stayed away for days. She tried to reason with herself in the small, square language of survival. It was a moment. It will pass. You need this job. You are good at this job. But reason has nothing on dread when your body announces news you're not ready to hear. The nausea arrived first, sneaky as a thief. The calendar confirmed what her heart had already suspected. The test on top of the washing machine blinked back 2 lines that looked like an order. She waited for a night when the house quieted into itself. After the last calendar alert and the last late email, when the silence felt like a mercy. He was on the back patio, glass in hand, fireplace licking fake logs with real flames. The stars over Fairfield were diffused by distance and good taste. "I'm pregnant," she said. He lifted his eyes for a fraction of a second, then back to the screen in his palm. "You're joking." "I'm not." He chuckled, a sound so gentle it stung. "There are procedures for this," he said, like he was talking supply chains. "Discretion. You'll be compensated." Days later, an envelope appeared under the door to the staff hall. Inside, a $50,000 check. The paper gleamed like a dare. No note, just numbers, the kind that tried to erase the word child and write inconvenience in its place. Alana sat on the edge of her bed with the check lying flat on her knees. She smoothed it like you might smooth a map, as if some other route would appear if you stared hard enough. She thought about the rent she could pay for a year, the daycare she could afford, the emergency room co-pays that wouldn't needle her at night. Then she thought about her mother's photograph, steadiness solid as a hand on her back. She folded the check in half, then in half again, then again until it was a hard little square. She did not cash it. She tucked it into the showbox under her bed, the way people in old movies hide letters that define them or betray them, or both. Richard avoided her with a precision more surgical than polite. Invitations filled the house. Lawyers' voices filtered through doors. On the TV in the kitchen, he smiled for shareholders, his mouth forming words like growth and long-term value. In the pantry, Alana swallowed ginger tea and learned how to move without swaying. One afternoon, she caught him looking. It happened in the reflection of the glass staircase. She was halfway up with a basket of linen. He was below with his jacket over his shoulder. Their eyes met not in real space, but in the mirror the house kept of itself. It lasted a blink long enough for her to see recognition flicker, long enough for him to bury it like a seed he had no intention of watering. Winter deepened. Snow came in a clean, costly silence. She finished her contract without fanfare and moved back to the Bronx, to a building that coughed when the heat kicked on and smelled like onions on the 3rd floor, and bleach on the 1st. She found work at a diner with coffee that could strip paint and regulars who paid in crumpled bills. She kept the showbox under her bed in this place, 2 between loose socks and the journalware. As her belly rounded, she wrote to the person growing inside her, "You'll be seen. I will make sure of it." Sometimes she woke before dawn and stared at the shadows on the ceiling, the city's light carving shapes she couldn't name. She tried to imagine a future that made sense. Then she'd lay a palm on her stomach and borrow her mother's voice, steady and sure. "Child, the world will tell you your life is cheap. Don't sell it to them." When the contractions started, She walked because cabs were luxury and ambulances were for emergencies that had witnesses, and held the rail on the subway so tight her fingers ached. At the hospital, the nurse said, "Breathe like it was easy." Alana did. The room flooded with bright. The world narrowed to a small human sound and then widened to include it. She counted 10 fingers, 10 toes, whispered a name. The eyes stayed closed. Hours later, a door opened. Expensive shoes hesitated on linoleum. A voice she knew took up too much space. And bitter memory turned, slowly, into the present tense. The first weeks blurred into a haze of exhaustion and fierce tenderness. Alana sat in the dim Bronx apartment with her son swaddled against her chest, listening to the radiator rattle like an old man clearing his throat. Nights stretched into mornings without rest. She whispered lullabies between sips of instant coffee, the sound of her own heartbeat syncing with the fragile rhythm of the child's breathing. His name was Caleb. She had chosen it alone. It meant faithful. She needed that reminder. But faith cracked when the letter slid beneath her door. She almost didn't see it at first, just another white envelope on the worn linoleum, the kind her landlord shoved under to remind her rent was late. But when she tore it open, the air left her lungs. Inside lay a check, the numbers long enough to make her hands shake. $100,000 this time, crisp, clean, as if more zeros could erase more shame. A typed note accompanied it. "Take this money. Move on. There is no future in lies." Our first instinct was to rip it in two. Her second was to fold it and hide it in the showbox with the first. In the end, she did neither. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at it for hours while Caleb stirred in his sleep. The voices in her head clashed like armies. You could pay for childcare. You could buy a crib that isn't secondhand. You could breathe for once instead of drowning in bills. Then her mother's voice cut through like steel. Money without respect is chains, not freedom. She set the check down, picked Caleb up, and pressed her lips against his tiny forehead. "You're not for sale," she whispered. Meanwhile, high above the East River, in a penthouse that glittered like a monument to excess, Richard Coleman poured another drink. The city stretched beneath him, glass towers stabbing at the clouds, but his gaze tunneled inward. He told himself he had done the right thing. Twice now, he had offered her escape, first 50,000, then 100. Any sensible person would have taken it, but she hadn't. She was stubborn, or foolish, or both. What unnerved him wasn't her refusal. It was the memory he couldn't shake. That morning in the hospital when sunlight had kissed the baby's face, and those eyes had opened. Storm gray, his eyes. He closed his own in the mirror, willing the thought away. His father's voice rang inside his skull, harsh and unyielding. "Never let them see weakness, boy. Weakness makes you pray." But was this weakness? Or was it truth clawing its way through the cracks in his armor? He slammed the glass down. "Draft the paperwork," he muttered to no one, as if legal contracts could bind DNA. His lawyer, Martin, typed efficiently from the leather sofa. "She hasn't cashed the checks," Martin noted. "If she keeps pushing, we'll need to smear her, paint her unstable." "A gold digger," Richard nodded, though his chest tightened. He wanted to agree. He wanted to believe it. But every time he closed his eyes, the baby's face hovered there. Back in the Bronx, life shrank to survival. Alana worked nights at the diner, pouring coffee for factory workers and cab drivers, her hands raw from bleach. She climbed 3 flights of chipped stairs each dawn, her shoulders aching, ears ringing with the sound of ringing phones she couldn't afford to answer. Neighbors whispered, "Some kind, some cruel. She's got a white man's baby." One woman hissed in the stairwell, "Thinks she's special now." But when Alana looked at Caleb, none of it mattered. His tiny chest rising and falling was proof enough that she hadn't been erased. One evening, exhausted, she opened the showbox under her bed. Inside, 2 checks, crisp against the edges of her journals. She ran her fingers over the paper like it might cut her. Then she shoved it back, harder this time, and whispered, "Not today." She picked up her pen instead. On the journal's first page she wrote to her son, "You were born in silence, but your truth won't stay silent forever." The story might have ended there, one woman surviving, one man denying, but truth is persistent. At midnight, Richard stood in his gym, fists slamming into a leather bag until his knuckles split. Sweat poured, muscles screamed, but it wasn't enough. The storm in his chest refused to quiet. He could buy buildings. He could silence rivals. He could bend senators with donations. But a child's eyes, those he couldn't buy, and deep down, beneath the bourbon and bravado, he knew it. He wasn't certain anymore. For the first time in decades, Richard Coleman, master of boardrooms, predator of markets, felt powerless. The penthouse glittered with its usual emptiness. Chandeliers sparkled over polished marble. Glass walls reflected the Manhattan skyline like a trophy, and silence pressed down heavier than any boardroom gavel. Richard Coleman should have felt invincible here. Instead, he felt hunted. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, drink in hand, staring at the East River. The bourbon swirled, amber and defiant, but his hand trembled just enough for the ice to clink. Behind him, Martin Hale, his lawyer and confidant, scrolled on a tablet, voice clipped and clinical. "She's stubborn, Richard. She hasn't cashed a single check. If she doesn't take the money, we make her look unstable. Mental health angle. A smear campaign. Once the press calls her a liar, it's over." Richard exhaled through his nose, steady but taut. "She's a maid, Martin. Invisible. Why hasn't she disappeared like she's supposed to?" Martin glanced up. "Because she has the child. And the child looks." He hesitated. "People notice." The words struck harder than intended. Richard turned sharply, eyes flashing. "He looks like every baby." But even as he barked, he remembered that hospital window, the shaft of light, the storm-gray eyes staring back at him with unnerving clarity. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in the king-sized bed, Evelyn absent as always, the sheets cold despite their expense. He closed his eyes and tried to summon the usual dreams of conquest, stock markets bowing, politicians begging, but the baby's face intruded. Not with cries, not with need, but with stillness. The eyes, his father's eyes, his own. He rose before dawn, restless, and stalked into his private gym. Each punch against the heavy bag landed with a name attached: Maya, Caleb, weakness. He wanted to beat it out of his body, to pound the truth into submission. Sweat blinded him, blood split across his knuckles, but the storm remained. The mirror across the room caught his reflection, jaw clenched, skin pale under the strain. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw not himself but the boy, staring at him from within the glass. He ripped his gaze away, chest heaving. By noon he was back in the boardroom, a place where power obeyed him. The long mahogany table gleamed, investors' eyes sharp, screens alive with graphs and numbers. Richard's voice returned to its usual cadence, measured, commanding, untouchable. Yet even here, the ghost followed. A shareholder's words blurred, replaced by a memory of Caleb's pale skin. The clink of a coffee cup sounded like a rattle in a crib. When someone asked about a new project in Detroit, Richard nearly said his son's name instead of the steel mills. For the first time in his career, he stumbled. That evening, Martin arrived at the penthouse again, folder under his arm. "We need to finalize a strategy. I'll draft a statement. We'll accuse her of trying to extort you. It will hold up in court." Richard stared at the folder but didn't reach for it. His jaw worked. "And if it doesn't?" Martin smirked. "With enough money, truth bends." Richard's stomach tightened. For years, that phrase had been his creed. He had bent laws, contracts, and people themselves. But now, in the privacy of his home, the words tasted like ash. "Not this truth," he murmured. Martin froze. "What? Nothing." Richard's tone sharpened, armor snapping back into place. "Draft it anyway." But when Martin left, Richard stood alone at his desk. He tore the checkbook in half, scattering numbers across the floor. He stared at the shredded paper as though the pieces might rearrange themselves into absolution. For the first time in his life, he wondered if money could fail him. Across the city, in a cramped apartment that smelled of fried onions and damp laundry, Alana rocked Caleb to sleep. The glow of a single lamp softened the chipped walls, turning the space into something almost tender. She hummed as she wrote in her journal, ink bleeding onto paper. "You were born in silence, my son. But your truth will not stay silent forever." Her hand trembled, but her resolve grew steadier with every word. Meanwhile, Richard poured another drink. The skyline glimmered like a crown, but he saw only those storm-gray eyes floating in the darkness. He swallowed hard, but the bourbon burned without comfort. He whispered into the empty room, voice breaking against his will, "My son." The sound startled him. It was as if someone else had spoken, and with those two words, the fortress he had built for decades cracked wider than he dared admit. The Bronx never slept. It groaned, it sighed, it rumbled with buses and laughter and arguments bleeding through thin walls. For Alana Johnson, the noise was both a comfort and a cage. After her evening shift at the diner, she climbed 3 flights of chipped stairs, balancing Caleb on one hip and a grocery bag on the other. The bag held nothing glamorous: day-old bread, canned beans, formula samples a kind nurse had slipped her, but to Alana, it was survival. Her apartment smelled of onions from Mrs. Ortiz downstairs and bleach from the super's half-hearted mop job. The heat clanked alive only when it felt like it. But inside those 4 walls, when she set Caleb down in the crib her neighbor had donated, the world softened. She'd hum an old church tune, and for a moment, it didn't matter that the paint peeled from the ceiling. Still, nights were long. Bills piled up like enemies. She took on extra shifts, scrubbing tables until her hands cracked, pouring refills for men who called her sweetheart without ever seeing her. When she walked home, she kept her eyes forward. Everyone in the neighborhood already knew she was the black maid who had carried a white billionaire's child. Whispers followed her, some sympathetic, some venomous. "She's strong," a woman at the bodega said. "Raising that boy alone. Strong?" Another sneered. "She thinks she's better than us 'cause she had his baby." Alana kept walking, chin high, shoulders tight. Loretta, an older woman who ran the food pantry at the local church, pulled her aside one day. "Don't you let their mouths make your spirit heavy," she said, pressing a can of powdered milk into her hand. "Your truth ain't theirs to twist." Across the river, in the penthouse glittering with cold light, Richard Coleman stood in front of his own mirror. He saw the man the world adored, ruthless CEO, king of steel, a face on magazine covers. But behind his eyes, he saw another face, smaller, fragile, with storm-gray eyes that refused to leave him. He worked himself harder, thinking exhaustion might drown out. Days blurred into meetings, deals, signatures worth billions. At night, he pounded fists into his leather bag, sweat dripping into his eyes, rage bleeding into every punch. Rage at Alana, rage at the boy, rage at himself. But when the room went quiet, when his fists stilled, the storm remained. He poured bourbon, but liquor no longer dulled it. He stared out at the city, but skyscrapers no longer made him feel taller. The truth followed him like a shadow dot in the Bronx. Alana found strength in small acts. She brought Caleb to the church pantry, where Loretta introduced her to other mothers. They swapped baby clothes, recipes, advice. They didn't look at Caleb like a scandal. They looked at him like a child. For the first time since the hospital, Alana felt seen, not as a liar, not as a gold digger, but as a mother. At night, when Caleb finally slept, she wrote in her journal. Her words became a shield. "You will grow knowing your worth. You will not be erased, no matter how powerful he is." She tucked the journal under the mattress, right next to the show box with the 2 checks. She never touched them, but their presence fueled her resolve. Each time she opened that box and saw the paper, she remembered what she refused to be bought. Meanwhile, Richard's lawyer, Martin, grew frustrated. "She won't take the money. She's defiant. We'll have to go nuclear, discredit her in the press, make her look unfit." Richard rubbed his temple. The old Richard would have agreed instantly, signing off with a flick of his pen. But now hesitation lingered. "And the boy?" he asked. His voice cracked slightly, enough for Martin to notice. "The boy is leverage." Martin replied coldly, "If we drag her through the mud, custody becomes impossible. He disappears from your life for good." For a moment, Richard imagined that the problem solved, the scandal erased. But then he saw Caleb's face, eyes locking on his through that hospital sunlight. Something twisted in his chest. He slammed his glass down. "Not the boy," Martin frowned. "You're letting sentiment cloud judgment." Maybe he was. Or maybe for the first time in his life, he was seeing judgment clearly. 2 worlds moved in parallel. In the Bronx, Alana rocked Caleb under the dim glow of a single lamp, whispering, You are mine, and that is enough. In Manhattan, Richard poured another drink, whispering to the empty air. My son. Neither heard the other. Yet both were bound to the same storm, pulled toward an inevitable collision. The first rumors slithered through tabloids like smoke, curling around headlines hungry for scandal. Steel tycoon's secret child, screamed one blog. Bronx Maid claims billionaire fathered baby, whispered another. At first, Richard dismissed them. Money could kill a story as easily as it built a skyscraper. He had buried worse, but this one refused to die. Pictures surfaced, grainy shots of Alana pushing a stroller down cracked Bronx sidewalks. Whispers that the baby's eyes were too pale, too strange, too much like his. On social media, strangers compared photographs of Richard in his youth to Caleb's tiny face. The resemblance was undeniable. At the diner, Alana overheard customers at the counter. You seen that Maid in the papers? Claims she's got Coleman's kid. Bold, if you ask me, another snorted. Or desperate. Women like that always want a payday. Alana stirred coffee until the spoon clinked hard against porcelain. She bit her tongue until it bled. She couldn't fight everyone's words, but she could fight for the truth. The pressure mounted until Richard's fortress cracked. Shareholders demanded answers. Board members whispered behind closed doors. Evelyn, his wife, fled to Europe, her publicist announcing she needed privacy. Richard slammed his fist on the boardroom table. It's nothing, a lie, a distraction. But Martin, always cold, leaned forward. If you want to end this, submit to a DNA test. On your terms. Control the narrative. Richard's stomach clenched. He imagined the boy again, storm gray eyes staring back. He imagined the truth clawing free. He wanted to say no, to bury it deeper. But denial had already failed. Doubt had grown into a roar. Fine, he spat. Draft it. But we control the release. The results came 2 weeks later, in an envelope heavy with inevitability. Richard held it alone in his study, the city glittering behind him. His hand hovered before tearing the seal. One word leapt out, positive. Caleb was his. No smear, no lawyer, no money could erase it. For a long time, he didn't move. The bourbon glass on his desk warmed untouched. He thought of his father's voice, weakness makes you pray. Then he thought of the boy's eyes, not weak at all, but unyielding. He pressed the paper flat against the desk, exhaling a sound that was half a laugh, half a sob. When the news broke, the city howled. Headlines ignited like wildfire. Billionaire Coleman confirmed father of Bronx child. From maid to mother, the scandal that shakes Wall Street. Steel King's fortress crumbles. Outside Alana's building, reporters swarmed. Microphones thrust toward her door. Cameras flashed when she carried groceries. Neighbors peeked through curtains. She held Caleb tighter and whispered, "You are not their spectacle. You are mine." Still, when she heard the radio that evening, the anchor's voice firm, deliberate, her knees buckled. Richard Coleman has publicly admitted paternity of Caleb Johnson after DNA results confirmed the connection. For the first time in months, she felt a strange weight lift. Not relief exactly, because the fight was far from over, but validation. The world finally knew what she had known from the beginning. Richard faced the cameras days later. A press conference called in a grand hotel ballroom, lights blazing. Journalists packed shoulder to shoulder. He stood at the podium, immaculate suit, face grave. He cleared his throat. The DNA results have confirmed what many suspected. I am the father of Caleb Johnson. The room erupted. Questions flew like daggers. Will you support the child financially? What about your marriage? Do you intend to pursue custody? Richard lifted a hand. I will not answer personal matters today. I will say only this: the child is mine, and I will not deny him again. His voice faltered on again. For the first time in his public life, the world saw him cracked out in the Bronx. Alana listened on the battered radio, Caleb cooing in his high chair. Her chest felt tight, almost suffocating. Yes, the truth was out. Yes, the lies had collapsed. But at what cost? Her private pain had been made public property. Strangers argued about her life on talk shows. Commentators called her a gold digger, a hero, a victim, a liar. She was all of them and none of them. Caleb babbled, oatmeal smeared on his chin. Alana wiped his face gently, whispering, "You're not a scandal, baby." You're just you. But she knew the storm was only beginning. Meanwhile, in his penthouse, Richard sat in silence. The city glittered, but he didn't feel taller. He felt exposed. Truth had finally spoken, and it would not be silenced again. The storm did not calm after the truth broke. It grew louder. News vans lined the curb outside Alana's building in the Bronx. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward like hungry beaks. Neighbors gathered at windows, whispering behind curtains. Children played hopscotch on the cracked sidewalk while reporters shouted questions. That cut through the air like knives. Alana, will you marry him now? Is this about money? Do you believe he'll be a real father? She kept her head down, Caleb bundled in her arms, his soft cheek against her shoulder. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only shield. Across town, Richard Coleman was fighting a different kind of war. The boardroom no longer obeyed him without question. Investors demanded stability, not scandal. Journalists called his name with mockery instead of reverence. His empire had weathered recessions, lawsuits, political shifts, but never this. And yet, amid the chaos, something had shifted in him. He remembered the hospital corridor, the sunlight falling on Caleb's face, the hesitation he'd buried under pride. That moment had grown roots inside him. Now it spread like ivy through the walls of the life he had built. So he did something no one expected. One rainy afternoon, without motorcades or press releases, he arrived at Alana's building. Just a man in a tailored suit, darkened by rain, carrying no shield but his own trembling resolve. Neighbors gasped. Reporters swarmed. Some jeered, others demanded selfies, a few cursed his name. But he ignored them all and climbed the worn stairwell that smelled of onions and bleach. When Alana opened the door, her breath caught. There he stood, richer than kings, yet looking more human than she had ever seen him. Rain clung to his hair. His eyes, those storm-gray eyes, flicked past her to the child in her arms. "May I come in?" he asked. Her instinct screamed no. But Caleb stirred, reaching out with tiny fingers. Against every wall she had built, she stepped aside. Inside, the apartment was small, cluttered, alive. Toys borrowed from neighbors scattered the floor. A second-hand crib stood in the corner, its paint chipped. A journal peeked from beneath the couch cushion. It was a world away from marble halls and chandeliers. Richard crouched, for the first time in decades, onto a floor that wasn't polished marble. He stacked blocks with Caleb. He watched them topple. He laughed, not the sharp bark of a businessman, but something unpracticed, softer. When Caleb spiked a fever, Richard rushed to the pharmacy, fumbling with dosage instructions, until Alana's calm voice guided him night after night. He returned, not always welcomed, not always trusted, but present. Slowly, awkwardly, he learned the rituals of fatherhood: bottle feeding at 2 a.m., pacing the floor with a crying child, whispering lullabies off-key. Alana watched from the doorway, torn between fury and forgiveness. This was the man who had once spat cruelty, who had thrown money like a weapon, who had denied her in the most vulnerable moment of her life. And yet, here he was, holding their son as if nothing else in the world mattered. Her heart ached with confusion. Was this redemption or performance? The world didn't make it easier. Tabloids speculated about marriage. Talk shows debated whether Richard's public visits were genuine or a PR stunt. Can a billionaire really change? One anchor sneered. Or is this just another headline he thinks he can control? Richard, for once, didn't answer. He let the noise rage while he sat on Alana's worn sofa, reading bored books to Caleb in a voice hoarse with fatigue. One evening, as cameras flashed outside, Alana confronted him. "You walk into this apartment like you're learning to be a father," she snapped. "But outside, the world is tearing me apart because of you." Richard's jaw tightened. He looked at Caleb, then back at her. His voice was low but steady. "Then I'll protect you." It was the first time he had spoken of protection not as ownership, but as a promise. Weeks passed. Slowly, the city's gossip shifted. The billionaire in the Bronx became a spectacle, then a curiosity, then unbelievably a story of hope. Headlines read, "Steel tycoon seen at food pantry," and from boardroom to playground. Coleman's unlikely journey. At a shareholder meeting, Richard stood tall, ignoring the outrage of his peers. "I am who I am, father and CEO, If you don't like it, vote me out. But I won't pretend Caleb doesn't exist. The room fell silent. For the first time, he chose vulnerability over power. Across town, Alana opened her journal that night. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "Your father carried you into a room full of eyes and didn't flinch. It doesn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, it's the beginning of a future where you will never have to wonder." If you were wanted, the days that followed weren't easy. Neighbors still whispered. Cameras still lurked. But in the cramped apartment filled with chipped walls and secondhand furniture, something stronger than scandal began to take root. One night, Richard held Caleb close, eyes wet with a grief he no longer hid. "He deserves a father who won't run again. I can't promise I'll get it all right, but I can promise I'll stay." Alana's throat tightened. She didn't answer. Not yet, because redemption wasn't words. It wasn't headlines. It wasn't even showing up once or twice. Redemption was staying when it was hardest. Redemption was proving, day after day, that love wasn't a check to be cashed, but a presence to be felt. And in that small Bronx apartment, as the city roared outside, the question lingered in the air like a final challenge. Was Richard Coleman truly changing? Or was this just another performance? Only time and the storm-gray eyes of a child would tell.